Okay guys, welcome to CIT 226, Data Integrity and Security. And today we'll be covering SQL Server as part of the installation process in database security. We'll be installing it on Server 2022 since that's the latest release of Microsoft operating system, and we'll be installing Microsoft SQL Server 2019. If you want, you can download the evaluation version of Server 2022 and Microsoft SQL Server 2019 from Microsoft website. It would work good for at least 180 days, and then you can decide if you want to purchase it. Identify the considerations that an administrator must take into account prior to the installation. For example, the requirements for the server operating system, whether it's 2019 or 2017, and then you'll check the compatibility or the system requirements. We'll be covering it in a minute. Install the Microsoft SQL Server 2019 for Windows operating system. It can be installed even on Windows 10, but make sure that it's at least Windows 10 Home Edition, have at least 4 gigs of RAM on your computer. Now configure Microsoft SQL Server 2019 services for Windows platform. Depends what kind of services you need. You'll install only those services for the SQL Server. Secure the installation and configuration of Microsoft SQL Server to avoid any kind of SQL injections. Now, Microsoft SQL Server significant database is an enterprise solution, has improved scalability, performance, and easy to use and low cost. If you have a complete suite of products from Microsoft and your server licensing and everything, it would be easy to include Microsoft SQL Server license in that. I won't say it's a very cheap product or low cost product. You'll have to pay premium price, and against that you get an excellent support from Microsoft. In case you are having any issues, so you can reach them out for the problems further. There are all sort of updates available on Microsoft website for the latest known vulnerabilities which are identified in the databases, and you can apply the patches both to the server operating system as well as to the Microsoft SQL Server. Now, there are certain requirements for SQL Server installation when you are installing it as an end user, which is a standard installation, and the installation which you are installing for an enterprise. The difference is that the enterprise application or the installation of SQL Server would be a central installation where all departments would be accessing it, though the server will be installed at a single place. Means you need a Microsoft SQL Studio, Management Studio, through which you will be accessing the SQL Server, which is remotely installed. Just like I showed you the actual SQL Server, how we are accessing it. We'll be installing the enterprise version of it, and then we'll install a Management Studio on it so that we can see that how it's installed and how can we access it. It's just like MySQL installation, where when we were installing, we had an option to install it as a dedicated server, and then we installed clients for it, which we called in MySQL Server as MySQL Workbench, through which we connected to the main database. It's the same thing on Microsoft SQL Server, that it would be installed on a central server remotely, and the clients would be accessing it through a username and password. Installation of a Microsoft SQL Server, simply as any other Microsoft application installation, administrators must take several decisions, understanding the requirements, available versions, and features necessary to design an effective solution. So you won't select all the options that you see in the installation of SQL Server. You'll be selecting based on your environment. If you're developing applications, if you are going for data warehousing, or anything related to that, so you'll be choosing the options from there. Now, the requirement for SQL Server 2019 is 2.2 gigahertz processor, 64-bit, because there is no 32-bit available anymore. You must have at least 6 GB of storage on your computer, and minimum storage requirement is 1 GB RAM, but that's a minimum. Comfortable limit is at least 2 GB. Appropriate hard drive space depending on the organization current or future needs, that how much space do you need for the SQL Server, because it expands over the period of time, and size of the database differs depending on which feature is installed. So the features that you are selecting for the installation of SQL Server would depend that how much space you are actually consuming on the hard drive. Supported platforms are not all editions of SQL Server 2019 support the same operating system. Because it's the latest one, it has higher requirements, like the minimum it could be installed is Microsoft Windows 10 Home Edition onwards from there. You'll have issues if you're installing it to the older operating systems. Dedicated, deciding on the most appropriate operating system is a critical choice, because you'll have to check that if in your organization you have switched to the latest operating system, or if you are still using the legacy operating systems. There could be organizations which are still using Windows 8 or 8.1, or there would be any bottlenecks due to the applications or the legacy applications that you are using, which is preventing you from adapting to the latest operating system. Determines the available features. Mistakes can damage the system performance or scalability. Operating system compatibility with Microsoft SQL Server 2019 is Windows Server at least 2016 onwards or Windows 10 onwards. Now, Windows Server 2016 onwards means that the minimum level of the operating system on which Server 2019, SQL Server 2019 can be installed is Server 2016. Now, software required to enable is at least you must have 4.6 .NET Framework and Microsoft Installer 4.6 or later. Microsoft Edge should be there, and the latest version of PowerShell, because PowerShell is required for lots of things if you want to troubleshoot the SQL Server itself or the operating system on which it's installed. Network design and architecture plays an important role, because it depends on the reliability and efficiency of the client and server environment. Because if your SQL Server is centrally installed and there are lots of users accessing it from the remote location, it must be powerful enough, and your network must be able to maintain or carry the load that it requires. Then test environment to ensure it can handle the data traffic, test network cards, switches, cables, and other things. So whenever we set up an SQL Server, we load it with the dummy data, and then we test it with the load, that if it's able to carry all the operations comfortably or not, and if there is a reachability to all users. Now, making the difficult decisions is customization, one of the SQL Server greatest selling points. Software includes many customization options that you can choose during the installation process. The available features vary from different editions of SQL Server. For example, the important decisions could be that which edition you will be installing. If you're installing it on a server, there will be a different licensing fee because it would be a dedicated server. For the rest of the clients like Management Studio, SQL Management Studio, through which you will be accessing the remote SQL Server, you don't need any license for that, because the main server itself, which is installed on a central location, will have a license of it, and the rest of the users can simply access the server and avail the features. Now, licensing options are there for different editions which were available and are still there on SQL. Or Express Edition is not there anymore. It used to be there in Server 2005 onwards. Now we have the Developer Edition, Standard, and the Enterprise Edition of it. Especially you guys would see the evaluation version because it's downloaded from Microsoft for free. You can test it, and then you can decide if you want to purchase it or not. Microsoft SQL includes several features. Administrators can include or exclude from the installation. Modular Packaging Gold provide the customization, lightweight server with environment-specific capabilities. And then Server 2 fundamental tools are there, which are required for the basic operations of SQL Server. Now, database engine is there, which is heart of the SQL database, responsible for data storage, retrieval, manipulation, security, queries, and all those other things. Replication and full text searches, and then reporting services provides different ways to represent and to deliver the data, because there is some data which is required across different applications. So how it would be sending it, it's very important. Analysis services provides analytical services, for example, online access services and data mining, etc., which is quite common these days. designed for fast and frequent processing of the data and queries. So they have tested it that if multiple departments are using the same database and running various different queries for their applications and operations, it should perform at an excellent speed. Now, integrated services are joins and normalize the data from different sources. Management tools include the SQL Server Configuration Manager, used to configure the installation of the SQL Server itself. Server Management Studio to administer the interface of SQL Server database through which you can create tables, access the information in that, run different queries on it, and perform operations. Business Intelligence Studio development for application development environment for the developers and programmers. Client tools enables the communication between the client and server, which is Management Studio in our case. And Server Profiler provide graphical user interface for different users to connect to the same database. For example, if two users are using the same computer to connect to a database, all can have their own different profiles through which they can access the services on Microsoft SQL Server. Now, licensing options are express and compact editions for free download. More available features come with the higher licensing cost. Three specific terms are per processor licensing, because it depends how many processors are there in your server. In most of the servers, we are using virtualization, so we can dedicate a number of processors for the SQL Server. Per server plus the device client access license, and then per user plus device license. Type of the CALs, which we call it as the client access license, can be for a work group, for a domain, or for the server itself. Now the installation begins. User begin desired copy of SQL Server. Hardware and software requirements are checked first, and then the additions and the features are selected. The prerequisites are, if not according to the requirements of SQL Server, it would give you a warning that you'll have to select, or you need to install certain .NET framework or Visual C++ files in order to continue with the installation. Now that's a typical interface that you'll see once you'll start the installation of Microsoft SQL Server. And as you can see that here on the main interface, since it's at the planning phase, you won't find any installation options appearing on the screen. It's only it's talking about the hardware requirements and documentation of it. In order to install it, you'll have to select the installation on the left hand side, and once you'll click on installation, you'll find the option, and in this option you'll be installing the SQL Server standalone with add and remove features, whatever things that you need. When you'll proceed, it would ask for the edition. Remember, we were talking about evaluation and express editions, developer edition, etc. You can select it from here. If you have purchased it and you have a key for SQL Server, you will enter the key during the installation. You can enter it later as well, but since this is the evaluation version, you don't need to enter it, and we simply proceed. Now, as you can see in this screen, there are lots of other options appearing. For example, database engine services, which are the core services, as we talked about, that it's the heart of the SQL Server database, which is the actual, and then you can read the information about it on the configuration and the feature description, which helps you in understanding that the feature that you are installing, it is required for which thing. And then you have lots of other features, for example, machine learning for Python and Java. If you need, you can select these things, but mind it that whatever you are selecting over here would increase the footprint of the installation. As you can see that it's giving the disk requirements, and it's showing you that actually this much space is available on the C drive, and the required or available space is there. So if you're selecting the features, it would show you that it's going to consume at least this much of space. So make sure before you continue installation that you have enough space available in your drive. Here there is an instance of it. Instances through which we call the SQL Server, or how we'll identify it in order to add it to our computer. It has a default instance as MS SQL Server. If you want to change it, you can change it for the ease so that it can be identified. As far as the security is concerned, it's always better to change the name of the instance so that it's not on default values, that if anyone wants to search it on the network, they can easily identify it. Once that's done, it would show you what it's going to install. For example, SQL Server Agent would be installed, Database Engine, and SQL Server Browser. Now you have an option that what kind of startup you want to have for the agent. You can select it over here as manual or automatic. I have changed it from default value manual to automatic, so that once my computer starts or once my server starts, it should start the agent automatically. Now here the book is saying that it's always better to have a Windows authentication method. I would prefer having both, because if you are having a mixed mode, it means that you must be able to log in using the account of the administrator as well as a dedicated account for Microsoft SQL Server. That helps you that in case if you will forget the user account password in a mixed mode, you still have the privilege to log into SQL Server through the administrator account. So it's always better to have multiple accounts over here. Further, if you want to add any users who must have access to this, you can simply click on add, and you can add a user just like you add in Windows for adding any privileges to the users. Once that's done, it would show you the installation once we'll start that it has successfully completed all the services. And then you can see on Server Configuration Manager, as we discussed in the lecture, it would appear, and you can see the instance name as we selected CIT226 SQL Server. The status of it is running, and the type of SQL Server agent is up, as well as the server is running. So it shows you the information from here. You can check it whether your SQL Server is responding or not. Now once that's done, in order to manage the server remotely, now that installation was for the dedicated server on which you installed SQL Server. In order to access the SQL Server remotely, you'll install a Management Studio, and Management Studio would help you to connect to a remote SQL Server. So you'll download it again from Microsoft website. It's available for free. The latest version of it is 18.10, and then you can see the path of it where it's installed. Once it's installed, it would ask you to restart, and as you can see, first of all, you'll select the database engine, SQL Server, which is the name of the server itself, / the instance name that we selected earlier. Once we'll select the SQL Server authentication. You'll find an option over here for Windows-based authentication as well. I have selected the server-based authentication, and you remember we just we entered a password over there. We'll use the same password, but the default username is SA. You can change that as well. You can have any username and a password just for the sake of security. And once you'll enter the username and password, you'll end up on this screen, which would show you that you are connected to the remote SQL Server, and these are the tables and databases which are appearing under it. Now, additional security considerations for SQL Server is Microsoft SQL Server popularity continues to increase because the security attacks are also increasing. You'll have to keep an eye that what are the trends, what are the known vulnerabilities on the SQL Server, and make sure that you are applying the patches on time. Security steps prior to the installation must be addressed promptly. Designers should plan the security strategy well ahead of time. So since we selected the database engine only when we were installing SQL Server, you can always add features later to the installation. But initially, you can go with the basic setup for the things that you need in your SQL Server. Of course, there are backup procedures for that. You can maintain a backup of the SQL Server for the data, for the entire setup, and things as you need. Now, best practices for SQL security is place the servers behind the firewalls or locked doors where people don't have access to the server itself. Use multiple internal and external firewalls to create the subnets and required strict authentication so that only those users will be able to access the SQL Server who have privileges to access it from specific IP addresses and MAC addresses. Isolate the database server from public networks and eliminate all connection to unnecessary segments of the network. If you don't want your database to be exposed to the outside internet, you must not have any connection of that database to the external world. For example, on your firewall, you'll define a rule that no one from outside the internet or outside the network should be accessing it. So it would be locked only within the network so that there are no penetrations taking place from the internet. Use very selective strategy when deciding which users to give permissions to access to the database, who will be accessing it, and then there will be different rights for the users. Some users would be the administrators to their tables, some would have only read-only access to it, while others can make changes to it. For example, if you have a new developer and he is developing an application and he wants to extract the information from the SQL Server, of course you don't give him access, an admin access to the server, since he is asking for a specific set of information. You can create a view for him and he can read the data after being authenticated on SQL Server. So the updated information will be available for him. He can use that information for the application development. Now configure the ports on the computer on individual basis to avoid the group range of exceptions. Whenever possible, never leave the ports open and unmanaged. So make sure that the ports that they are defined are limited to a specific use. If any application is using SQL Server for on a specific port, it should be exclusively allowed on that. Not only that, if employees are coming and leaving the organization, you must keep an eye on that the accounts which were in possession of someone who has left the organization, you must remove all those settings from the system before the new person joins the organization. Now choose servers for SQL Server installation that use NTFS file system. Of course, nowadays all latest operating systems have NTFS file system. It provides extra security through encryption and access control list permissions, etc. It encrypts the connection to the user SSH or SSL, secure socket layer or secure session, which we use it instead of telnet. During installation, apply the policy-based management to manage it centrally and use the encryption and auditing services for the transport and data encryption, which backs up without affecting the user, enhancing the auditing features, which allows the tracking the data and to access the modification, etc. Apply the password to the services individually as we did it during the installation. Even once the users are using it, you will give specific username and password to the users. During the installation, choose the Windows authentication mixed mode, avoids the password being sent over to the network, and strict enforce the strong password policy on the active domain level so that people are not keeping repeatedly same passwords or the passwords which are in a sequence. Change the default usernames whenever possible. Change the username root passwords also, so that if somehow anyone has penetrated into the network, they won't be able to use the same username or default passwords in order to make use of the SQL or to exploit the data which is there on SQL Server. Never store passwords in a clear text format. Use a strong encryption technique so that no passwords are being leaked out on the network. A multi-layered approach to access creates specific rules, server applications, database layers, etc. Run services under separate Windows accounts that are local or have minimum rights. Apply principle of least privilege when creating accounts. Give the minimum access to everyone. If they need an access to a certain service, they'll request it later. But you will issue the access rights to the SQL Server based on the basic requirements of the user. If they need specific or exclusive access to certain tables, you can grant permissions later. Keep security updates and patches current. Configure the auditing services to enable the logging auditing both OS and SQL Server level. That helps us in identifying that who logged in to the operating system or SQL Server and at what time. So a audit keep logs of all the security issues related to the authentication, failures, services, if they are running or not, related to all those things. You can review the logs frequently in order to get the basic information about the security of the SQL Server. Disable all guest accounts that you have built in Windows, as well as any default accounts which are there on SQL Server. Group database users on a different global group. If possible, on Active Directory, you'll create a group of users for the database administrators or simple users, so that you know that these are the users who will be accessing the SQL Server only. Use error logs to ensure the security of it, and never use the administrative account to run the database services engine. If you want to use though you are the administrator of the database, if you want to use the database yourself, it's better to create your own account and use it with the privileges which are not as powerful as an administrator, so that if somehow your account is also compromised, people or any hacker would not put your data into jeopardy. Use the account having the least privileges. Ensure all file and disk shares of the SQL Server computer are read-only whenever possible.